Tonight, we explore the life and legacy of Gaius Julius Caesar, Rome's most iconic leader, general, and visionary. A man whose ambition, charisma, and military genius would redefine the Roman Republic and pave the way for an empire that would last for centuries. From conquering Gaul to crossing the Rubicon, from political brilliance to betrayal by those he once called friends, Caesar's story is one of power, passion, and a tragic fall that still echoes through history. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we're working on some boring ones just to balance things out. Now it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some background noise, and dive into what we've prepared for you tonight. Together. Julius Caesar was born on a warm day in July, in the year 100 BCE, beneath the golden skies of ancient Rome. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar, carried respect, but no one could have guessed that the boy born into that modest household would become the man who would forever reshape the Roman world. He came from the gens Julianae, old patrician family that claimed lineage from the goddess Venus herself, or so legend held. Noble blood, yes, but not wealthy. By the time Caesar was born, the Iuli had lost much of their fortune. His father, also named Gaius, held a local position of influence. His mother, Aurelia, strong, intelligent woman, would prove to be an even more pivotal force in shaping her son's future. Young Caesar was raised with discipline and drive. From an early age, he displayed a sharp intellect and a natural charm, but it was a dangerous time to grow up in Rome. Civil wars, power struggles, and political purges plagued the city. Though the Republic still stood in name, in practice, it had become a brutal arena where ambition reigned and alliances crumbled overnight. When Caesar was just 16, his father died suddenly. That left him head of the household, a heavy burden for a teenage boy. At the time, Rome was ruled by the ruthless dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a general who saw enemies everywhere. Caesar, through no fault of his own, was tied to one of them. He had married Cornelia, daughter of Sulla's rival. Cinna. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce her. Refusing meant risking his life. But Caesar refused anyway. That single act of defiance could have ended him. Instead, it defined him to survive. He went into hiding, constantly on the move, under watch. And yet, Sulla, impressed by something in the young man's eyes, spared him. Years later, Sulla would mutter, almost as a warning, "In this Caesar, there are many men." He meant there was danger, ambition, and immense potential in him. He was right. The boy who once fled soldiers would one day command legions. But for now, Caesar was just getting started. After surviving Sulla's dictatorship, young Caesar returned to Roman life with sharpened instincts and a hunger for more. Even as a young man, he understood that Roman politics was a game of ambition. To win, one needed allies, timing, and nerves of steel. Caesar had all three, but first, he needed experience. He joined the military, serving in Asia Minor, where he earned the Civic Crown, a prestigious award for bravery in battle. His time in the field taught him the reality of power, and he wanted it. But adventure always seemed to find Caesar. While sailing the Aegean Sea, he was captured by pirates. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed. "You don't know who I am," he told them. "Asked for 50, and they did." For weeks, he lived among the pirates, joking, writing poetry, promising that once freed, he would return and crucify them. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. After his ransom was paid, Caesar raised a small private fleet, hunted them down, and kept his word. But in a rare gesture of mercy, he slit their throats before crucifying them so they wouldn't suffer. That story spread quickly through Rome. Bold, brutal Caesar. Back in Rome, he rose swiftly through the political ranks, first as a lawyer, known for fiery oration, and then as an elected official. But the Republic was still torn between two dominant forces, the conservative optimates and the populist populares. Caesar, ever the strategist, sided with the people. He aligned himself with the legacy of Marius, his uncle by marriage, who had championed the commoners. This made the elite uneasy. Caesar dressed finely, speaking boldly, winning public favor was becoming a threat. He soon became Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, a position of vast influence. He gained power not through war, but through votes. But he knew that day would come. Caesar understood that politics in Rome was about more than speeches. It was about performance, image, and control. He was building his legacy carefully, quietly, and soon he would make his move. By the late 60s BCE, Caesar was a rising force, but he wasn't alone. The Republic was unraveling. The Senate was fractured. The people restless. Three men dominated the political scene: Caesar, Pompey, the great Rome's most famous general, and Crassus, the richest man in the city. Each had power. Each had ambition. Each had reason to oppose the Senate. Caesar saw an opportunity. In 60 BCE, he orchestrated a private agreement, secret partnership. History would later call the first triumvirate. It wasn't official. It wasn't legal. It was simply three ambitious men promising to support one another against their enemies. Pompey wanted land for his veterans. Crassus wanted favorable tax reforms. Caesar, he wanted the consulship, Rome's highest office. With their support he got it. As consul, Caesar pushed through reforms, fulfilled his end of the bargain, and bypassed Senate resistance by appealing directly to the people. But even that wasn't enough. He arranged to be appointed governor of Gaul, a vast, mostly region stretching across modern France and Belgium. To others, Gaul was a distant, dangerous frontier. To Caesar it was a stage. He wasn't just a politician now. He was becoming something far more powerful. A general with an army loyal not to the Senate, but to him. As he prepared to leave Rome, many underestimated him. To them, Caesar was just a clever man with charm, not a real warrior. They had no idea what was coming. Gaul would change everything. It would turn Caesar from a cunning politician into a living legend, and for Rome would mark the beginning of the end, bringing the wild frontiers under Roman control. Caesar crossed rivers, marched through mountain passes, and led his troops through brutal winters. He crushed rebellions, forged temporary alliances, and wrote detailed letters back to Rome. His now famous Commentary de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, recounted his campaigns in vivid detail. But these weren't just military reports. They were propaganda crafted with care to shape public opinion and keep his name burning bright in Roman minds. Caesar's men loved him. He shared in their hardships. He marched with them, bled with them, paid them generously, praised their courage, and never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He was more than a commander. He was a symbol. One of Caesar's greatest tests came in 52 BCE, when a Gallic chieftain named Vercingetorix united the tribes in a final, desperate stand against Rome. Caesar pursued him relentlessly across the land, finally trapping him at Alesia, a fortress on a hill. There, Caesar conducted one of the most brilliant sieges in ancient history. Outnumbered and low on supplies, he ordered his men to build two massive walls, one facing inward to contain the enemy, and one facing outward to defend against a relief army. Two forces attacked from two directions, but Caesar held the line. When the battle ended, Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul, after years of resistance, was effectively Roman. Back in Rome, Caesar was hailed as a hero by the people, but to the Senate, he had become a threat. His fame, his wealth, and, most dangerously, his loyal army gave him more personal power than any Roman had held in generations. Though the Gallic campaigns had ended, Caesar knew a critical truth. He could not return to Rome as a private citizen. The Senate, now under the influence of his former ally turned rival, Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return. It wasn't a request, it was a trap. If he complied, he would be stripped of his command, vulnerable to arrest or worse. And so, once again, Julius Caesar began to plan. By 50 BCE, Caesar stood on the edge of a decision, one that would change history. According to Roman law, no general could lead an army across the Rubicon River, the boundary into Italy. To do so was treason. But on a cold January night in 49 BCE, Caesar stood at the river's edge, and with one step into its waters, he made his choice. Alia iacta est, he is said to have whispered, the die is cast. Rome trembled. News of the crossing spread like wildfire. Panic seized the city. Senators fled. Pompey fled. The man once seen as Rome's greatest general left without a fight. Caesar marched south not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, or so he claimed. This was no peaceful transition, it was civil war. Over the next year, Caesar moved fast. He took control of Italy, crossed into Spain, and defeated Pompey's forces there. Then he crossed the sea into Greece for the final confrontation that it came at Pharsalus. In 48 BCE, despite being outnumbered, Caesar's discipline and tactical brilliance carried the day. Pompey fled to Egypt only to be murdered before Caesar could reach him. When Caesar arrived and saw Pompey's severed head, he is said to have wept. It was not the ending he had wanted for a rival, a former ally, and the man who had once married his daughter. But the war was not over. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon not only in body but in destiny. He could never return to the old republic, and he had no intention of trying. After Pharsalus, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, the sparkling heart of Egypt. But instead of peace, he walked into yet another civil war, this time between two royal siblings, Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra was clever, ambitious, and radiant. She understood power. She understood politics. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a carpet, unrolled before Caesar's feet. Whether fact or myth, it worked. A powerful and intimate alliance was born. Caesar chose Cleopatra's side not just out of attraction, but strategy. Egypt was rich. Its grain fed Rome, and Cleopatra promised stability. But choosing her meant war. Ptolemy's forces laid siege to Caesar in Alexandria. It was a fierce, unexpected battle, yet Caesar's tactics held. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy drowned while fleeing across the Nile. Cleopatra was restored as queen, technically Corolla, with a younger brother, but in truth, she held the reins. Caesar remained in Egypt for months. He and Cleopatra journeyed along the Nile, visiting temples and marvels of an older world. In time, she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, called Caesarion. Whether Caesar officially recognized him remains debated, but the bond between them was real. Still, Caesar could not stay. The Roman world was still burning. A rebellion had broken out in Asia Minor. Caesar crushed it with stunning speeds, so fast that he sent an infamous message back to Rome. Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was a phenomenon, and that force was returning home. When Caesar returned to Rome, it was not as a servant of the Republic. It was as its uncontested master. Though civil war continued in some pockets, Caesar had been named dictator for 10 years, and soon after, dictator for life. It was a title that shook the very core of Rome's identity. The Republic had long vowed never to kneel to a king, and yet, here was Caesar passing laws, issuing decrees, controlling the Senate. He pushed bold reforms, easing debt, redistributing land, expanding the Senate to include people from across the empire. He even introduced a new Julian calendar, system still echoed in the one we use today. But power breeds resentment. He wore purple robes, the color of royalty. His image was printed on coins, something never done for a living Roman. He sat while senators stood. Statues were built. Honors were endless. Then came the most dangerous moment, the crown. During the festival of Lupercalia, Mark Antony offered him a golden crown before a cheering crowd. 3 times Caesar refused. To the people, it was proof of his loyalty to the Republic. To the Senate it felt like theater, a test. And behind the columns of the Senate House, whispers turned to daggers. Was Caesar becoming king in everything but name? Had the Republic already died? Some senators believed it had, and they began to plot. Perhaps Caesar sensed the danger, or perhaps he believed himself untouchable. But the warnings were clear. A soothsayer once told him, "Beware the Ides of March." March 15th still. Caesar laughed it off. He believed in fate, but more than anything he believed in himself. That morning, his wife Calpurnia begged him not to go. She had dreamed of his statue bleeding, and Romans washing their hands in the blood. But Caesar ignored the signs. At midday, he walked to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. The very place named after the man he once defeated. It would be the stage of his final act. As he entered, he was surrounded. First, conversation. Then chaos. One man grabbed his toga, another struck. Then another. And another. The air filled with gasps, steel, and betrayal. Caesar resisted until he saw Marcus Junius, Brutus. Brutus wasn't just a conspirator. He was someone Caesar had trusted, perhaps even loved. Some say he whispered in Greek, "Kaisu tenin, you too, my child." And then he fell stabbed 23 times. Teknan. You too, my child. With those words, Caesar fell. He was stabbed 23 times, though only one wound was truly fatal. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic. They thought the people would cheer them, that they would be hailed as heroes, but instead Rome froze. The streets did not celebrate, the people mourned, and Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal friend, would soon turn the tide with a fiery speech that lit the flame of vengeance. The knife had ended a life, but not the legacy. Julius Caesar was gone, but Rome was far from saved. His assassination, intended to restore the Republic, had the opposite effect. Instead of peace, it plunged the city into chaos. Crowds wept at the sight of his lifeless body. Shops closed. The Senate fell silent. Rome held its breath, unsure of what would come next. And then the tide shifted. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony stepped forward, not as a politician, not as a general, but as a grieving friend. His eulogy, filled with sorrow, anger, and raw intensity, ignited the people. He read Caesar's will, aloud, revealing that Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen and public land for the people. Even in death, he had thought of them. The crowd erupted. What began as a political murder was now seen as betrayal of the people's champion. But the real twist came next. In his will, Caesar had named a young relative, Gaius Octavius, his eighth great-nephew, as his adopted son and legal heir. The boy would now be known as Gaius Julius Caesar, Octavianus, and later, simply, Augustus. Together with Mark Antony, Octavian formed the second triumvirate, joining forces with a third man, Lepidus, to hunt down Caesar's killers. The assassins Brutus and Cassius, leaders of the conspiracy, were tracked across the empire. In time, both would die by their own hands after defeat in battle. Justice, at least by Roman terms, had been served. But even this new alliance wouldn't last. Antony, drawn to Cleopatra and the allure of Egypt, began to drift away from Rome. Octavian saw an opening. He used Antony's romance and his growing ties to the Egyptian queen as a weapon, painting him as a traitor to Rome. War was declared. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, the forces of Octavian faced those of Antony and Cleopatra. It was a decisive blow. Their fleets were crushed. Soon after, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. The last resistance had fallen, with no rivals left. Octavian stood alone, and with that, the Republic, already weakened, breathed its last. Octavian would become Rome's first emperor. The title Caesar became more than a name. It became a symbol of imperial authority. It would echo through history, through emperors like Tiberius, Nero, and Constantine. It would stretch beyond Rome into the word Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia. Julius Caesar had changed the world, not just through war or politics, but through the sheer force of his will. He lived as a man, ruled like a legend, and died as a symbol. And over 2,000 years later, we still tell his story. And Creek, just outside Shopsburg, Maryland, on September 17, 1862. The fields of Antietam turned red. At dawn, Union forces attacked the Confederate left flank. The battle moved from cornfields to sunken roads, from stone bridges to open hills. Musket smoke clouded the sky. Soldiers fired blindly through the fog of war. Entire regiments were cut down in minutes. At the Bloody Lane, a sunken farm road, thousands of men died in hand-to-hand combat. The road, once used by wagons and farmers, became a trench of bodies. By midday, the Creek's stone bridge became another flashpoint. Union soldiers charged again and again, only to fall back under heavy Confederate fire. Eventually they crossed, but at an unbearable cost. By nightfall, the guns fell silent. In just 12 hours, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. No ground was truly gained, no army decisively won, but Lee retreated, and the Union claimed it as a victory. President Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for this moment. With the Confederates pushed back, he released the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in rebelling states would be free. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now about freedom. Europe watched closely. Any chance of Britain or France supporting the Confederacy began to fade. Lincoln's proclamation reframed the conflict and added moral weight to the Union cause. But the soldiers who fought at Antietam weren't thinking about proclamations. They remembered the screams, the silence, the crows circling overhead. Antietam was a turning point, not just in strategy, But in Seoul. By the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee was bold once again. After victories in Virginia, he led his Confederate Army north into Pennsylvania. His goal was simple: bring the war into Union territory, shake the North's will to fight, and force a political solution. But the Union Army, now under General George Meade, followed closely behind. They met near a small town called Gettysburg. On July 1st, Confederate troops clashed with Union forces just northwest of the town. The battle began almost by accident, but it would grow into the largest engagement ever fought on American soil. By the second day, both sides had dug in. Union soldiers held the high ground along Cemetery Ridge, while Confederates launched fierce assaults on the flanks at places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield. The air was thick with smoke, shouts, and cannon fire. Thousands fell, but the lines held. Then came July 3rd and Lee's fateful gamble. He ordered Pickett's charge, sending 15,000 men across open fields toward the Union center. They marched shoulder to shoulder into a hailstorm of artillery and rifle fire. The charge was brave, but it was doomed. Few reached the Union line. Most never made it halfway. The Confederate army, battered and broken, began to retreat. Lee had lost over 28,000 men, a third of his army. The North had suffered as well, with 23,000 casualties, but they had held the line. Gettysburg was the turning point. The Confederate advance into the North was over. Lee would never invade Union territory again. The momentum after years of bloody stalemate had finally shifted. A few months later, President Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a national cemetery. His speech was only 2 minutes long, but it carried the weight of the war. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It became known as the Gettysburg Address, a quiet, powerful reminder of what was at stake. The fields of Gettysburg grew silent. Again the fallen were buried. The survivors marched on, but the war was far from over, and the cost was still rising. By late 1863, the war was no longer about swift victories or grand strategy. It had become a slow, grinding struggle, measured not in miles gained, but in lives lost. Every battle took something that could never be replaced. In Chickamauga, Vicksburg, Chancellorsville, and the Wilderness, the fighting was relentless. Dense forests caught fire from cannon blasts, trapping wounded men in flames. Rivers ran red. Fields once used for planting crops became cemeteries. Soldiers wrote home describing horrors they couldn't fully explain. One wrote, "I have seen things that will follow me to my grave." Another, "I don't sleep much anymore, not because of fear, but because of memory." The Union's campaign in the West, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, focused on total war, wearing down the Confederacy. Through constant pressure and overwhelming numbers, Grant earned a reputation as a butcher by some, but Lincoln saw what others didn't. He fought to win, not just to survive. Meanwhile, in the South, resources dwindled. Towns were raided, railroads destroyed, fields burned, families starved. The war was no longer just fought by armies, it was felt by every civilian. And, still, letters traveled back and forth. A young Union soldier wrote to his mother, "I miss the sound of the wind in the wheat. Here there is only smoke and silence after the fighting." From the South, a woman wrote in her diary, "My youngest has not had shoes in months. I trade salt for flour. We hear the cannons at night." Both sides believed they were right. Both believed they had no choice. Yet the cost was staggering. By the end of 1863, the death toll had surpassed 300,000. 500,000 more were wounded, many carrying lifelong scars, physical and emotional. Doctors worked intense with sores, not medicine. Amputation was often the only option. There were no antibiotics, no real anesthesia, no peace of mind. Cemeteries filled faster than they could be named, and still the war went on because neither side was willing to give up. Not yet. And in that refusal, the nation bled. By early 1865, the war was nearing its end, but it had not yet loosened its grip. The Confederacy was collapsing slowly and painfully. Its economy was in shambles. Railroads lay twisted and burned. Cities were emptying. Supplies were running out. And still Confederate soldiers fought. Many shoeless, hungry, and exhausted, clinging to a cause that was slipping through their fingers. Meanwhile, Union General William Tecumseh, Sherman marched through the South, not just fighting armies but destroying the infrastructure that supported them. In his march to the sea, he burned crops, tore up railroads, and left behind a trail of ashes from Atlanta to Savannah. It was war made total, designed to break the South's will in Virginia. General Ulysses S. Grant pressed relentlessly against General Robert E. Lee. For months, Grant laid siege to Petersburg, cutting off the last lifelines to the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee's forces were surrounded, outnumbered, and starving. Finally, in April 1865, the defenses crumbled. On April 2nd, Richmond fell. Confederate government officials fled. Fires consumed parts of the city. Confederate flags were lowered, and Union soldiers marched into the capital that had once symbolized the rebellion. Just a week later, on April 9th, Lee met Grant at a quiet village in Appomattox Courthouse. The meeting was calm, almost solemn. Lee arrived in full-dress uniform, Grant in a mud-splattered coat. They spoke not as enemies, but as soldiers who understood the cost of what they had done. With dignity and restraint, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most important force. Grant allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and sidearms. He even offered them rations. There was no celebration, no humiliation, just silence. The war, at least on paper, was over. Within weeks, the remaining Confederate armies surrendered. Flags were furled. Camps emptied. Guns were laid down, never to be raised again. But though the fighting had stopped, the wounds remained. The country had survived, but it was broken. Rebuilding would take years. Healing would take generations. And just days after Lee's surrender, tragedy would strike again, this time not on the battlefield, but in a quiet theater in Washington. DCTHE cannons had gone silent. The uniforms were folded away. The war was over. But the wounds of the Civil War didn't heal with surrender. Just 5 days after Lee's capitulation at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The shot echoed across the nation, not just the end of a man, but the loss of a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Lincoln had called for a gentle peace, a rebuilding with malice toward none, with charity for all. His death left the country uncertain, grieving, and deeply divided. The Reconstruction era that followed tried to knit the Union back together, but it was far from smooth. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights, but resistance came quickly and violently, especially in the South. New systems of oppression, black codes, Jim Crow laws, and voter suppression emerged in place of slavery. Freedmen, who had once dreamed of equality, found themselves trapped in new forms of poverty and persecution. The scars were not only legal or political, they were emotional, etched into the American psyche. In cemeteries across the nation, mothers and fathers wept over graves. Over 620,000 Americans had died. Entire towns had lost every eligible man. Soldiers returned home missing limbs, carrying memories they rarely spoke of. And yet, the war lived on, not through battles, but through symbols and stories. The Confederate flag still waves in parts of the country. Statues of generals were erected not just to remember, but to shape the narrative of the past. For some, these are reminders of heritage. For others, they are monuments to a rebellion born in defense of slavery. Even today, the arguments continue about history, about justice, about what the Civil War was truly fought for, and what it still means. The war shaped the nation's identity. It clarified who counted as American, and who had to fight for the right to be seen. It didn't end with the PPOMATTOX. It echoes in protests, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in quiet conversations. The American Civil War was fought with rifles and cannons, but its legacy is carried in the hearts of generations. It was never just about the past. It was, and still is, about what kind of future this country wants to build. Those final days were ruled by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last of a long imperial line tracing back to Rome. He ruled not with wealth or vast legions, but with dignity and resolve. Though his realm was small, his spirit was not. To the east, however, a powerful force was rising. The Ottoman Empire, under the rule of a young and ambitious sultan named Mehmed II, was closing in. Constantinople stood in the way of Ottoman expansion, a Christian stronghold, surrounded on all sides by Muslim lands. For Mehmed, The city was not just a military target, it was a prize, a symbol, and a prophecy. Many believed Constantinople could not fall. Its walls had been invincible for centuries, but few realized how weak the city had truly become, and how determined the young sultan was to make history. And so, as spring approached, in the year 1453, the stage was quietly being set. The city that had once ruled the world was about to face its final siege. In the east, a young ruler was preparing to make history. Mehmed II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, had ascended to the throne at just 19 years old. By 21, he was already a seasoned strategist, politically astute, and unshakably ambitious. But Mehmed didn't just want to expand the empire, he wanted to claim immortality, and for that, he had set his sights on one prize above all others: Constantinople. Ancient city was more than a political or military goal. It was the spiritual successor of Rome, a Christian stronghold, and a symbol of enduring resistance. It had defied conquerors for over 1,000 years, but Mehmed believed its time had come, and that he would be the one to bring it down. For years, the Ottomans had encircled the city like a tightening noose, taking nearby territories, building up naval power, and carefully preparing. Mehmed knew that brute force alone would not be enough. Constantinople's famed walls, 3 thick layers of stone and moat, had repelled countless invasions, so he turned to innovation. At Mehmed's court arrived a man named Orban, a Hungarian engineer and master of gunpowder weapons. With Mehmed's full support, Orban constructed massive siege cannons, some so large they required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to move. The largest, known simply as the Basilic, could hurl stone projectiles over 1,000 pounds each. As winter melted into spring, Mehmed gathered his forces. By April 1453, an army of over 80,000 soldiers, infantry, cavalry, and engineers began to move toward the city. With them came siege weapons, ships, and supplies for a long campaign. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine prepared his defenses. He had fewer than 7,000 men, including volunteers and mercenaries. Odds were staggering, yet he would not abandon the city. To Constantine, Constantinople was not just his home, it was the last stand of the Christian East, the heart of an empire, and a sacred trust passed down through generations of emperors. It was a jewel he intended to claim. The siege was no longer a matter of if, but when, and the young sultan was ready. For over 1,000 years, the walls of Theodosius had stood as a symbol of Constantinople's invincibility. Originally constructed in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, these legendary fortifications wrapped around the city like a stone shield, towering layers of defense that had repelled countless enemies. With 3 massive walls, reinforced towers, and a deep moat, they stretched for nearly 4 miles across the western edge of the city. Generations of invaders had tried and failed to breach them. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Rus, even the fearsome armies of the Crusades, all had struggled to overcome them, and now, in 1453, the walls would be tested one final time. When Mehmed's army arrived outside the gates of Constantinople in early April, he ordered his men to set up a massive siege encampment. Tents spread across the rolling hills like a sea of color. Siege towers, trenches, and cannons were positioned within striking distance of the land walls. Then, the bombardment began. Mehmed's enormous basilic cannon unleashed thunderous blasts, firing stone balls that smashed against the walls with terrifying force. Day after day, the earth shook beneath the defenders' feet. Stone-cracked. Dust filled the air. Still, the walls held. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine and his defenders worked tirelessly, repairing breaches by night, redistributing men across the battlements, and reinforcing weak points with rubble and wood. They had no choice but to endure. The walls had always been Constantinople's greatest defense, but now they were being systematically dismantled by gunpowder, a weapon of a new age. At the same time, the sea walls along the Golden Horn remained secure, protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the harbor. Behind it sat the city's small Byzantine fleet and a few allied Genoese ships. As long as the harbor was closed, a naval assault seemed impossible. Still, Mehmed watched, calculated, planned. He understood that to take Constantinople, he had to break its spine, those legendary walls. And if the land approached, he couldn't bring a swift victory, so he would find another way in. The siege dragged on, and the defenders, outnumbered and isolated, wondered how much longer they could hold. For weeks, the walls of Constantinople had held, though battered by Mehmed's massive cannons. The defenders had repelled wave after wave of assaults. Morale inside the city remained high, even as the odds grew darker. The land walls were damaged, but not breached. The Golden Horn, the city's protected northern harbor, remained closed, sealed shut by the heavy iron chain stretching across its entrance. Behind that chain floated the last hope of the Byzantines, a small defensive fleet, and a few vital Genoese ships. As long as the Golden Horn remained secure, the city could not be fully surrounded, but Mehmed had no intention of waiting forever. Then came one of the most brilliant and audacious moves in siege warfare. On the night of April 21st, 1453, under cover of darkness and the hum of anticipation, the Ottomans began to move their ships over land, using greased wooden logs as rollers. Engineers and laborers hauled dozens of warships out of the Bosphorus, over the hills behind Galata, and into the calm waters of the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the chain. It was an impossible sight by morning. The citizens of Constantinople looked out from the walls and saw something they could hardly believe. Ottoman warships had appeared inside their supposedly impenetrable harbor. Panic spread like wildfire. Now the city was surrounded on all sides. By land and sea. The defenders had to divide their already thin forces to cover the new naval threat. Cannon fire came from every direction. Arrows and flaming bolts lit up the sky. Constantinople was no longer just facing a siege. It was facing total encirclement inside the city. Emperor Constantine ordered desperate countermeasures. Ships rushed to defend the harbor. Fireships were launched to try and burn the Ottoman vessels. Chains were reinforced, but the damage had already been done, not just tactically, but psychologically. Mehmed's bold maneuver had broken the defenders' sense of security. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. The city's famed walls were still standing, but Constantinople's isolation had become complete. And as the pressure mounted, the siege entered its final and most desperate phase. In the heart of a crumbling empire stood a man who refused to yield. Constantine, the 11th the last emperor of Byzantium, was not a ruler of grand palaces or vast armies. He commanded a dying empire, a city more than a nation. Yet in the twilight of Rome's 1,000-year legacy, he stood with quiet resolve. He was not surrounded by luxury, but by ruin. Much of Constantinople lay abandoned. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. The empire's last possessions had been pawned for weapons, food, and soldiers. Still, Constantine ruled not with gold, but with dignity and loyalty. Day after day he walked among the people. He dined with soldiers. He prayed with priests. He led not from a throne but from the battlements. As the siege worsened, desperation grew. Constantine sent urgent messages to the west, begging for help from fellow Christian kingdoms. A few ships arrived, mostly from Genoa and Venice, brave volunteers who slipped past Ottoman blockades to join the defense. But the great armies of Europe never came. Political divisions, old grudges, and distance dulled the West's response. Still, the emperor did not abandon hope. In a symbolic and powerful act, Constantine reopened Hagia Sophia, not just for Orthodox Christians, but for Catholics as well. For the first time in centuries, the divided branches of Christianity worshipped together inside the great cathedral. Bitter theological debates were set aside in the face of extinction. Unity mattered more than doctrine. Inside the ancient walls of Hagia Sophia, under its vast golden dome, they held a final divine liturgy. Candles flickered, incense rose, and the city prayed, not for victory, but for peace, for courage, and for the souls of those who would soon perish. Emperor Constantine stood among them, not as a distant monarch, but as a man, knowing full well that he might not survive the coming dawn in the darkness. He made his final preparations. He gathered his generals. He spoke to his soldiers, and he made a vow that he would die defending his city, his people, and the memory of a civilization that had once ruled the world. The sun set on May 28, 1453, for what would be the last time over a Byzantine Constantinople. Within the city's worn walls, a hush fell, an eerie, sacred quiet that blanketed the streets like mist. Everyone knew the final assault was coming with the morning. The Ottoman bombardment had grown heavier in the previous days. Breaches in the walls were widening. Patrols reported signs of mass movement. In the enemy camps, the storm was about to break. Inside the imperial palace and the quarters of commoners alike, the people prepared, not just for battle, but for farewell by nightfall. Emperor Constantine Palaiologos gathered his remaining generals and nobles. His voice was steady as he gave a speech that would echo through the ages. He thanked them not as subjects, but as brothers in arms. He asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged. And then, he gave them one final order: to fight and die with honor. There would be no surrender. They were told they were not merely defending a city, but the soul of an empire, the last breath of Rome, and that history would remember them not for surviving, but for standing when no one else would. Elsewhere, the people gathered in the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, under its golden dome, now dimly lit with candles. Priests, monks, soldiers, mothers, and children filled the vast space, Orthodox and Catholic, merchant and beggar, side by side. Voices rose in prayer, not for deliverance, but for strength. Some wept, others stared in silence, a few smiled through tears, holding loved ones close. Outside the walls, the Ottoman camp was alive with energy. Fires burned in long rows, drums beat a steady, ominous rhythm. Soldiers sharpened blades, cannons were prepared for one last barrage. In his command tent, Sultan Mehmed II reviewed his plans. Every division had its orders, every cannon its target. He believed the city would fall by midday back within the walls. Constantine XI, wearing plain armor without royal insignia, mounted the battlements and looked out at the enemy camp. He crossed himself quietly, then descended to his post at the weakest part of the wall. There would be no sleep that night, only waiting before dawn broke on May 29, 1453. The Ottoman cannons roared once more. The final assault had begun. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers charged the shattered sections of the land walls. First came the Barshabazauks, the irregulars, poorly trained, expendable, and sent to exhaust the defenders. Then came the Anatolian troops, more disciplined, heavily armed. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, fought with desperation and fury. Greek and Genoese soldiers rained arrows, hurled stones, and poured boiling oil from the battlements. For a time they held their ground, but the Ottomans kept coming. Then came the Janissaries, Mehmed's elite guard, fresh, disciplined, and relentless. They surged toward the most damaged part of the wall, the gate of St. Romanos, where weeks of bombardment had left a massive breach. In the chaos of fighting, tragedy struck. A small side gate, known as the Kirkaport, had been left unlocked, likely by mistake. A group of Ottoman soldiers discovered it, slipped inside, and raised the crescent flag atop one of the inner towers. Panic spread through the city, with enemies now behind the walls. The defense began to crumble. Emperor Constantine, refusing to flee, removed his imperial regalia and joined the melee as a common soldier. According to legend, his final words were, "The city is lost, but I live." He charged into the fray and was never seen again. As the Ottomans poured through the breaches, the defenders broke ranks. Some fought to the death, others retreated toward the harbors, or sought refuge in churches. Blood ran in the streets. The cries of the wounded echoed off the ancient stones. By midday, the last resistance had been crushed. The city that had withstood centuries of siege had finally fallen. Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople through the gate of Carisius. His soldiers lined the streets cheering, but the Sultan remained silent, gazing upon the city with solemn pride. He had done what no one before him could. The city was his. After 1,123 years, the last great outpost of the Roman Empire, the Second Rome, had fallen. The ancient world had drawn its final breath as the Ottoman flag rose above Constantinople. The ancient city descended into chaos. For 3 days, according to the custom of conquest, the victorious Ottoman soldiers were given free rein. The fall of the city was not just military, it was human. Looting and plunder began almost immediately. Homes were ransacked, churches were pillaged, ancient relics were torn from their resting places. The proud streets of Constantinople, once lined with mosaics, markets, and scholars, echoed now with screams. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, hundreds of civilians had sought sanctuary. Mothers clutched their children, priests clung to icons. Many believed a divine miracle would protect them. But when the Ottoman soldiers arrived, the doors were forced open. The sacred marble floor was trampled. The Golden Dome, once glittering with centuries of faith, shook with the sound of weapons. Men were killed. Women and children were taken into slavery. The cross atop the cathedral was torn down. And yet the church itself was spared from destruction. On the afternoon of May 29th, Sultan Mehmed II entered the city. He did not arrive with fire or fury. He rode solemnly through the broken gates and into the heart of the fallen empire. Upon reaching Hagia Sophia, he dismounted, walked inside, and stood beneath its towering dome. In silence, he ordered the looting to stop. Then, in a symbolic gesture of conquest and transformation, he bowed toward Mecca and prayed. The sacred Christian cathedral would now become a mosque. Its walls would remain, but its purpose had changed. Mehmed was no ordinary conqueror. He was a man of vision and calculation. Though Constantinople had been claimed through war, he sought to rebuild it, not destroy it. He ordered the protection of surviving citizens. Within days, craftsmen, scholars, and administrators were brought in from across the empire to restore the city's function as a capital. The name Constantinople remained in use, but it slowly began to fade in everyday speech. The city was now part of something new, a bridge between East and West, between Islam and Christianity, between the ancient world and the modern one. The sack had ended, but a new era had begun. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than the loss of a city. It was the end of an era. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the beating heart of the Byzantine world, a city of emperors, theologians, warriors, and artists, and in a single day, it passed from empire to empire, from cross to crescent, from past to future. The fall of Constantinople and the end of the Byzantine Empire, the final remnant of the Roman world, had long stood as a symbol of Christian power, Roman law, Greek learning, and imperial legacy. Its golden mosaics, vast libraries, and soaring cathedrals represented the soul of a civilization that had outlived its Western twin by nearly a millennium. And now, it was gone. The death of Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, marked the closing of a lineage that stretched all the way back to Augustus Caesar. His disappearance during the final charge gave birth to legend. Some claimed he lived, spirited away, waiting to return and reclaim the city. But history had moved on under Sultan Mehmed II. Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul, the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The city, scarred but not destroyed, began to pulse again with life. Mosques rose beside old churches. Markets flourished. Scholars, artists, and traders from across the Muslim world filled its streets. Mehmed embraced the legacy of the city he had conquered. He took the title Caesar of Rome, claiming not just territory, but continuity. To him, the Ottoman sultans were the rightful heirs of the Roman emperors, carriers of civilization. In the West, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves. Christian Europe, once complacent, was shaken awake. The Eastern Orthodox world was now without a capital. And Greek scholars fleeing the city's fall carried their manuscripts west, to Italy, where their arrival helped ignite the Renaissance. The fall also reshaped global trade. With land routes to the east, now under Ottoman control, European kingdoms turned to the seas. Their search for new trade routes launched the age of exploration, giving rise to maritime powers like Portugal, Spain, and eventually Britain. And yet, even centuries later, the memory of Constantinople lingers, in its layered architecture, in the meeting of East and West, in the name itself, whispered with reverence by historians, dreamers, and descendants of a fallen empire. Constantinople did not vanish. It transformed from Christian Rome to Muslim Istanbul, from imperial capital to modern megacity. It lives on a bridge between worlds, a city of memory, a name etched in the stones of time. The rise and legacy of the samurai. The samurai did not begin as noble heroes or romanticized warriors. They were born out of necessity, a response to chaos. By the 9th century, the imperial court in Kyoto was losing control, though the emperor still ruled in name. His reach no longer extended to the far provinces. There, landowning nobles known as daimyo began acting as independent rulers. They collected taxes, governed villages, and most importantly, hired armed men to protect their land. These warriors, skilled with bow and sword, evolved into a class known as the samurai. At first, they were little more than private militias, but as centuries passed, their role deepened. They became defenders of order, enforcers of clan law, and symbols of authority in a land increasingly divided by civil strife. Japan was fracturing. Rival clans clashed for territory. Power changed hands through blood, not ballots. Out of this turbulence, the samurai rose, not just as tools of war, but as a class of their own. By the late Heian period, 794–1185, they had become indispensable, the backbone of military power. Their loyalty shifted, no longer to the emperor, but to their daimyo, and to each other. This era saw the rise of two great warrior clans, the Terra and the Minamoto. Their conflict would spark the Genpei War, a brutal civil war that reshaped the nation and brought about the first shogunate. But even before the titles and politics, the samurai held something deeper, an identity. They trained relentlessly, not just in combat but in mental discipline. They lived by unwritten codes of loyalty, restraint, and duty. Though their armor was lacquered and their swords raised, they often lived humbly, close to the land and far from courtly luxuries. This was not yet the age of fantasy, but the foundation of something enduring. What began as armed men on horseback was becoming a way of life. Bushido, the soul of the samurai. As the samurai rose in power, so too did the need for something to guide them, not just in battle, but in life. Out of centuries of warfare, discipline, and tradition, a moral compass emerged. It was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was never a single written doctrine. It was a living code shaped by Buddhist calm, Confucian loyalty, and Shinto purity. It demanded more than strength, it asked for character. At its heart were 7 virtues: rectitude, courage, balance, respectfulness. To the samurai, these were not ideals, they were obligations. A warrior was expected to act with justice, even when inconvenient, to face death without fear, to be generous to the weak, respectful to the wise, and brutally honest with himself. Above all else, he owed loyalty to his lord, his family, and his name. Failure brought shame, not just personal but communal. To die with honor was preferable to living in disgrace. This is why the act of seppuku ritual suicide was revered. If a samurai was captured, betrayed his lord, or committed a grave offense, he could take his own life to cleanse his soul and restore his family's honor. It was a death with dignity, a final act of control in a world ruled by chaos. But Bushido was not all steel and sorrow. It also called for kindness, especially to the defenseless. A samurai was a protector, not a tyrant. He was expected to be humble, well-read, and emotionally restrained. In battle, he fought with precision. At home he studied poetry and practiced stillness. This balance between sword and soul separated a true samurai from a mere killer. Bushido turned warfare into philosophy. It turned violence into honor. Even centuries after their decline, the code endures, not just in history books, but in the way Japan remembers what it means to live with discipline, grace, and unwavering purpose. The katana, a samurai's salt to the samurai. The sword was not just a weapon, it was the heart of their identity. The katana, with its graceful curve and single-edged blade, was more than steel. It was said to hold the soul of its wielder. Forged over weeks by master smiths, the blade was folded hundreds of times, purified, and quenched with ritual precision. The process was sacred. The result, a weapon as beautiful as it was. Deadly samurai often carried 2 swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. Together, they symbolized not just martial power, but the inner world of the warrior, a world ruled by discipline, honor, and the eternal edge of the blade. Together, they formed the Daiso, a paired set of swords, symbolizing the unity of strength and discipline. But owning a sword was not enough. It had to be mastered. From childhood, samurai trained in kenjutsu, the art of the sword. Every movement was deliberate. Every strike was crafted not merely to defeat, but to reflect inner control. To hesitate was to die. To act without intention was to dishonor the blade. Combat was as much about mental stillness as physical skill. Many samurai embraced Zen Buddhism, which taught that the mind must be clear, detached, and free from fear. In the silence before a duel, in the breath before a strike, there was no past or future, only presence. This spiritual balance shaped their fighting style. Samurai did not flail or rage. They moved with calm precision, like wind through a forest. It was this fusion of steel and serenity that made them both feared and deeply respected. Off the battlefield, swords were never drawn without cause. To unsheath a blade was to accept the possibility of death, either for one's enemy or for oneself. A samurai might live his entire life without ever using his katana, but he would rather die than dishonor it. Swords were passed down through generations, wrapped in cloth and guarded with reverence. In some families, a sword was considered more sacred than a temple relic. Even in death, the sword remained close. Samurai were often buried with their blades, a final gesture of loyalty to the soul they had lived by. In the end, the sword was more than a weapon. It was a mirror shining back the discipline, humility, and spirit of the man who carried it. As Japan drifted away from imperial court control, real power began to fall into the hands of those who could raise armies just with gold, but with loyalty and fear. Across the country, powerful clans rose to prominence, each led by a daimyo. These clans controlled vast stretches of land. Their banners flew high over valleys, mountains, and coastal fortresses. Beneath those banners served thousands of samurai. Among these rising powers, two clans would shape the course of Japan's future: the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was generational. Political marriages, betrayals, and shifting alliances fueled a growing fire. And when the flames finally erupted, they ignited the nation in the Genpei War. From 1180 to 1185, the Taira and Minamoto clashed bitterly for control. Samurai battled across fields and rivers under red and white banners. Entire provinces burned. Each victory brought new treachery. Each defeat gave birth to legend. It was during this war that the image of the samurai, both feared and poetic, was truly born. The final battle came at Danura, a naval clash where the Minamoto delivered a crushing blow to the Taira. Their young emperor, just 6 years old, was drowned by his own grandmother to prevent his capture. With that, the Taira were no more. Victory gave rise to a new order. In 1192, the Minamoto leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was granted the title of shogun, military ruler of Japan. The emperor remained in Kyoto, divine in name but stripped of real power. A new government, the shogun, founded on the sword, upheld by samurai loyalty, and driven by the ambitions of rival clans. Over time, new families rose and fell. The Hojo, the Ashikaga, the Takeda, and the Uesugi, each fought for dominance. Each commanded warriors trained, from birth, shaped by Bushido, and ready to die at their master's word. Feudal Japan was no longer ruled by ideals. It was ruled by alliances, armies, and the ever-turning wheel of war. And at the center stood the samurai, both shield and sword. For the samurai, war was always near, but peace was never wasted. When not riding into battle or serving their samurai lived lives of discipline, duty, and constant preparation. Even in quiet seasons, the possibility of conflict shaped their world. They did not relax, they refined. Daily life began early. Training in swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship remained essential, but so too were the skills of the mind. Samurai practiced calligraphy, literature, poetry, and strategy. A warrior had to be as thoughtful as he was deadly. The greatest among them balanced strength with subtlety. Children born into samurai families were taught to endure pain, obey without hesitation, and show respect at all times. Even a bow carried meaning, measured, practiced, and precise. Manners were not just etiquette, they were an expression of inner discipline. In the home, a samurai's life was austere. Clothing was plain but clean. Meals were simple: rice, vegetables, fish. Wastefulness was frowned upon. Every action had purpose. Every word was weighed. They lived with the awareness that death could come at any moment, not with fear, but with readiness. A samurai was taught never to cling to life, but to fulfill his duty, whatever the cost. In rare moments of peace, many practiced the tea ceremony, chanawua, a quiet ritual of boiling water, preparing matcha, and serving guests with grace. To outsiders, it appeared delicate. To the samurai, it was a battlefield of its own, testing humility, attention, and presence of mind. Others found clarity through ink painting, composing haiku, or meditating beneath trees. These simple acts connected them to the impermanence of life, a central truth in both Zen and samurai philosophy. But even in stillness, they remained alert. Spies could be anywhere. Loyalties could shift. Allies could betray. A samurai might share tea with a guest one night and face him across the battlefield the next. So they lived with grace, but guarded hearts. In the shadow of war, the samurai carved out lives of honor, awareness, and precision. Every breath was a preparation, every day a quiet rehearsal for the final moment. They lived in a world of discipline and steel, but also of spirits, rituals, and unseen forces. The samurai believed life was not separate from the spiritual realm. Every mountain, tree, and stream could house a kamiya, divine spirit, from Japan's ancient Shinto beliefs. These spirits were not distant gods, but living presences able to offer protection, fortune, or calamity. Before battle, samurai visited shrines, bowed before torii gates, and prayed for guidance and strength. Offerings of rice, sake, or incense were made not from superstition, but from reverence for the world they could not see. Many also followed Zen Buddhism, a path of silence, simplicity, and awareness. Zen taught that truth was not found in words but in direct experience. Through stillness and meditation, the samurai trained their minds to be calm, unshaken by fear, and anchored in the present moment. This mental clarity was essential in battle. The difference between chaos and mastery, between life and the perfect strike. Their strength came not from brute force, but from a quiet mind. Yet the samurai world was not only divine, it was also haunted. They believed in restless spirits of the dead. Warriors who died with hatred, regret, or unfinished duty were said to return, unable to cross into the afterlife. Their presence was felt in cold winds, in flickering lamps, and in whispers that stirred at the edge of sleep. Some samurai carried protective talismans, symbols hidden beneath their armor, charms meant to ward off spirits, misfortune, and curses. Even the bravest warrior did not dismiss the unseen. Legends spread around campfires of kitsune, fox spirits who could shapeshift and deceive, of tengu, bird-like creatures said to dwell in remote mountains, tricksters or protectors, depending on the tale. These weren't mere stories, they were woven into the samurai's spiritual reality. Life and death, seen and unseen, were deeply interwoven. Samurai were taught to face both with calm and clarity, to walk through forests with reverence, to fight without fear of ghosts, to die knowing their spirit might linger unless their death was honorable and their duty fulfilled. In the world of the samurai, the sword was sharp, but the soul walked softly through a land of shadows. In the 13th century, the greatest empire the world had ever seen turned its gaze toward Japan. The Mongol Empire, under Kublai Khan, had already conquered China and Korea. Now, the Khan demanded submission from Japan's rulers, the shogunate in Kamakura. When Japan refused, the Mongols prepared for war. In 1274, an invasion force of nearly 30,000 men sailed from Korea. The samurai waited on the shores of Kyushu, uncertain of what was to come. The Mongols fought with new tactics, tight formations, gunpowder bombs, and volleys of iron-tipped arrows. The samurai, trained for ritualized one-on-one duels, were stunned, but they held their ground. After a day of brutal combat, the Mongols retreated to their ships. Then, that night, a violent storm struck. Ships were torn apart on the rocks. Thousands of invaders drowned in the black waters. The Japanese believed this storm was no accident. It was a gift from the gods, a kamikaze, a divine wind. But Kublai Khan was not finished. In 1281, he launched a second invasion, this time with over 140,000 men, one of the largest amphibious forces in history. Japan had prepared. Coastal defenses stood ready. For weeks, fierce battles raged, and then again the winds rose. A second, even more powerful typhoon struck. The Mongol fleet was shattered. Ships were broken, scattered, or sunk. Survivors were hunted on land. Once again, the invasion failed, not by sword but by sea. To the samurai, it was more than fortune. It was divine affirmation, a sacred duty to protect their homeland, not just with blades, but with their very existence. The Mongol invasions left deep scars. Defense costs drained the shogunate's treasury. Samurai promised rewards, received. Little discontent brewed. Seeds of unrest were planted. But the legacy of the kamikaze endured. It became a symbol of protection, a spiritual shield around Japan, a reminder that, through discipline, sacrifice, and fate, the land had been preserved, not by steel alone, but by the wind. For centuries, the samurai had shaped Japan, serving lords, waging war, and living by the sword. But even the strongest, steel, dulls. By the early 1600s, Japan entered a new era of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. After generations of conflict, the country was unified. The capital moved to Edo, now Tokyo. The daimyo were brought under strict control. With peace, the samurai's role began to change, no longer needed on the battlefield. Many became bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars. They still wore their swords, still held status, but their days were now filled with scrolls, not skirmishes. Some welcomed this shift. They studied poetry, practiced the tea ceremony, helped govern a nation growing in culture and stability. But for others, peace was a quiet torment. A warrior without wara, blade without an enemy. Bushido, the code of honor, remained, but the world around it had changed. In the mid-19th century, change came again. In 1853, Commodore Perry arrived from America, demanding Japan open its ports. The Tokugawa government, unable to resist Western pressure, signed unequal treaties. Dissatisfaction surged. The Emperor Long, a symbolic figure, began to reclaim real power. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. The shogunate was dissolved. The samurai class abolished. New laws stripped them of privileges. They could no longer wear swords in public. Their stipends vanished. Many were forced to find new paths as teachers, merchants, or military officers in a Western-style army. Some adapted, others resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, marked the last great samurai uprising. It ended in defeat, a final, noble stand for a vanishing way of life. The samurai as a class were gone, but their spirit remained. Their values, discipline, loyalty, self-sacrifice became part of Japan's cultural DNA. Even in defeat, they endured, transformed, remembered not in rank or armor, but in soul. The age of the samurai has passed. Their castles are quiet. Their swords rest behind glass. Their banners no longer ride the wind. And yet, they have never truly left. In every bow of respect, in every cup of tea offered with grace, in every act of quiet discipline, the samurai spirit lingers. Their values did not die. They flowed into modern Japan, into loyalty to craft, mastery in effort, and honor in everyday action. Bushido lives on in how students study, how artists create, how craftsmen build with precision. Their stories became legend. Writers, poets, and painters captured their courage and elegance. In the 20th century, filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa gave them new life on screen. Ronin, exiled warriors, drawn in silence and dignity. Even in modern martial arts, Kendo, legacy breathes, bows before combat, clean, measured movements, mutual respect. Each kata, each motion, a living tribute. Globally, the samurai became a symbol of restraint in power, discipline without cruelty, and grace under pressure. In a fast-moving world, the image of a lone samurai beneath cherry blossoms reminds us to slow down, to move with purpose, to carry ourselves with quiet dignity. They were not perfect. They lived in times of contradiction and violence, but within their lives was something universal, a search for meaning through mastery, through loyalty, through self-control. That is why they remain with us, not in armor or command, but in principle. They are shadows not cast in darkness, but preserved in memory, soft echoes of a time when a single man, with a sword in hand and a code in heart, could shape the world around him. The samurai are gone, but their spirit still walks the mountain paths, bows before the shrine, and lingers in the stillness before the storm.